Whenever we see a catastrophic event on the news, it is so incredibly easy to just throw our hands up and think, well, Mother Nature is angry again. We instinctively blame the storm, the earthquake, or the flood for all that devastation. But as I was reading through this chapter from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, I realized something pretty wild. The actual disaster part, that is largely our own doing. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into the science of why disasters happen. And spoiler alert, it really isn't just about the weather.
This text presents this incredibly fascinating idea. Disaster risk is a social construction. And honestly, this is the core thesis of our explainer today. Think of a natural hazard, like a massive hurricane or a severe drought, as a spark. We literally cannot stop that spark from happening, but we can absolutely control the amount of dry tinder we leave lying around in our communities, right? That dry tinder, that's our human vulnerability. The IPCC report makes it crystal clear that we build the conditions for a disaster long before the storm ever actually hits our shores.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by breaking down the anatomy of disaster risk. Then untangle exposure versus vulnerability. Explore the real-world dimensions of vulnerability, look at coping and adaptive capacity, and finally, move from risk to resilience.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the anatomy of disaster risk.
To really wrap our heads around how disasters happen, the IPCC treats risk almost like a solvable math problem. It goes like this: disaster risk equals hazard multiplied by exposure multiplied by vulnerability. It's a simple formula, but it brilliantly shows us that if any of these elements is zero, the overall disaster risk is zero. The physical event itself is literally only 1/3 of the equation. So let's break these three critical variables down. First up is the hazard. The IPCC defines a hazard as the possible future occurrence of natural or human-induced physical events. Basically, it's the physical event itself. The heavy rain falling, the ground shaking, the wind howling. It's that initial spark we talked about. On its own, if a hazard happens in a completely empty, uninhabited field somewhere, it isn't a disaster at all. It's just weather.
Next, we have exposure. Exposure is defined as the inventory of elements in an area in which hazard events may occur. Simply put, it's who and what is physically standing in the way of that hazard. If we build a bustling town on a known river floodplain, well, our exposure is high. If populations and economic resources just weren't located in these potentially dangerous settings, the problem of disaster risk simply wouldn't exist in the first place.
And finally, we have vulnerability. This is defined as the propensity of exposed elements to suffer adverse effects when impacted. Remember the dry tinder? This is it. Vulnerability is all about the existing weaknesses, the poverty, the lack of coping capacity, or just flimsy infrastructure that allows the hazard to actually cause serious harm. Now, to be vulnerable, you do have to be exposed, but, and this is absolutely vital to understand, being exposed doesn't automatically make you vulnerable.
Which brings us right to Section 2, exposure versus vulnerability.
There's a super common confusion between being exposed and being vulnerable that we really need to clear up to grasp this topic. So imagine a wealthy, highly developed neighborhood built right on a floodplain. They have extremely high exposure, but because they have sturdy houses built on stilts, fantastic insurance, and the financial means to evacuate early, they actually have very low vulnerability. Now contrast that with a marginalized, low-income community located miles and miles inland. Their physical exposure to floodwaters is actually quite low. However, their housing is structurally weak, they completely lack emergency resources, and there's zero safety net. Their vulnerability is incredibly high. For them, even a minor weather event could be a total catastrophe.
Let's move on to Section 3, dimensions of vulnerability.
So what actually creates all that high vulnerability? The IPCC text points out that it's generally the outcome of skewed development processes. We're talking about things like rapid and unplanned urbanization in hazardous areas, which, by the way, is a massive driver. As cities expand too fast, people get pushed into marginal lands. We also see environmental mismanagement, demographic changes, and a sheer scarcity of livelihood options for the poorest among us. When families are forced to live in informal settlements on steep, landslide-prone hillsides just because they have absolutely no other economic options, that is a social and economic process actively creating disaster risk. And here is a heartbreaking but powerful example of how deeply our cultural and social norms can create those distinct vulnerabilities. During the catastrophic 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, women were disproportionately impacted. Why? Well, it definitely wasn't biology. It was because social roles placed the burden of child and elder care squarely on their shoulders, which significantly slowed their escape. On top of that, societal norms in certain affected areas simply didn't encourage survival training, like learning to swim or climb trees, for girls in the same way they did for boys. Their vulnerability was entirely socially constructed.
Okay, let's head into Section 4, Coping and Adaptive Capacity.
Now, what's really interesting about this next concept is that it shows humans aren't just helpless victims waiting around for the next storm. We are active managers of our own risk. The report draws a really fascinating, distinct line between just surviving an event, which is our coping capacity, and actively changing our systems, which is our adaptive capacity. Let's break that down a bit. Coping capacity refers to ex post actions, meaning actions taken after the fact. It's reacting, absorbing the shock, and just surviving. Think of setting up temporary emergency shelters or handing out relief supplies after a storm. Adaptive capacity, on the other hand, is all about ex-ante actions, actions taken beforehand. It's anticipating the risk and fundamentally transforming our structures, like rewriting building codes or moving whole communities out of harm's way entirely. The text actually warns us that poorly planned coping can sometimes increase future risk. For instance, after Hurricane Mitch in El Salvador, temporary emergency shelters were set up. But when the NGO's support inevitably ran out, those poorly constructed temporary shelters just became permanent housing. When earthquakes hit a few years later, they completely collapsed. So coping just isn't enough. We have to actively adapt.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 5, From Risk to Resilience. We've talked a lot about the theory and the formulas, so let's look at a totally inspiring real-world example of building adaptive capacity right from the ground up. Following the absolute devastation of Hurricane Mitch in 1998, the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna women of Honduras received barely any external support. So what did they do? These grassroots women organized themselves to reduce their community's exposure and vulnerability to future disasters.
Just look at the concrete actions they took. They didn't just sit around and cope. They transformed their society. They organized and repaired houses and public buildings all by themselves. They actively campaigned to buy safe new land to relocate the poorest families out of hazardous zones. To protect their livelihoods, they set up 16 tool banks and 5 seed banks. They even created the very first Garifuna farmers market to secure their local economy, and, this is brilliant, they planted wild fruit trees along the coast to prevent soil erosion. They aggressively addressed the environmental, economic, and social dimensions all at once, building multiple layers of genuine resilience.
So, the big takeaway from all this? We have got to flip the script. The core message from the IPCT text is that we must completely abandon the model of simply waiting to respond to disasters after the fact. We have to start actively managing and aggressively reducing our underlying disaster risk beforehand. Look, we might not be able to control the hazardous sparks that nature throws at us, but we can absolutely manage our exposure and clear out that vulnerable dry tinder.
I want to leave you with one final, provocative question to chew on today. If vulnerability is indeed a social construct, what are we building today? Just take a look around your own hometown, look at your own city's ongoing development. Are we building true resilience and adaptive capacity, or are we just laying out fresh, dry tinder for a future disaster? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a really clear new lens to view the world through. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll catch you next time.